This is Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today. Levi Brackman here, your host. I'm really excited to present to you this conversation that I had with Yehuda DovBer Zirkind. Now, this is a very long episode. It's over 2 hours, but I think it's really worthwhile listening to. Yehuda DovBer is an incredibly learned person. He's a big Talmid Chacham. He's also very, very well versed in all areas of Jewish literature and scholarship, traditional scholarship, as well as general scholarship and Bible scholarship and biblical criticism and a critical approach to the Bible and to the Talmud. And he's a very deep thinker, and he is a person who is steeped in tradition, not only personally, but also from his lineage. He is a direct descendant of the founder of the Chabad Hasidic school, Rabbi Zalman of Liadi, otherwise known as the Alter Rebbe or the Balatanya, or the author of the Shulchan Aruch Harav. And he therefore comes with a very unique perspective. And I really had a very enjoyable time talking to him. He actually stayed with me for the entire Shabbos, and we had many hours of enjoyable conversation around the table over a number of bottles of wine. And this is a little piece of the conversation that Yehuda DovBer and I had over this last weekend. We recorded this conversation Erev Shabbos, and it's worthwhile listening to. This is a conversation between myself and Yehuda DovBer, where we really delve deep into what it means to have a religious journey. And we both have a very honest conversation about this. And I think just a lot of people will appreciate it. And maybe it's thought-provoking for some as well, helpful for others. But here I present to you my conversation with Yehuda DovBer Zirkind. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about who you are so the audience can know.
Okay, my name is Yehuda DovBer Zirkind. I grew up in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, Lubavitch family. I studied in Chabad yeshivas for my formative education, 20 plus years. I've also worked as a teacher and writer in the Chabad system. In 2006.
So what were you teaching and writing in the Chabad system?
Well, I taught in a Masifta, Yeshivas Lubavitch, Toronto.
And what did you teach there?
I taught Gemara, Tanya.
And how old were you when you were teaching? Were you like as a Magachir or?
Yeah, I was a Magachir. I was about 22 or 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I also taught, from the age of about 18 or so. I taught in the summer yeshiva in Portland, Oregon, and other places as well. I've been a learning teacher and
So you used to wear a langerekel?
Correct.
Right, and an up hat.
That's right. That's the Zirkind garb, as we call it.
Not all the Zirkinds.
Not all the Zirkinds, but many.
The Montreal Zirkinds didn't.
Right, but that's a different branch of the family.
Okay.
Yeah. But I wore that garb, and I was very much within the Lubavitch system. And then I went on my own religious journey, and I ended up in Israel in 2006. I moved to Israel in 2006. I've been living there since in Yerushalayim.
Did you do tzava at all?
No, I was exempted. I got a p'tor from the army. And I studied in various places there, in different yeshivas, like Beit Morasha, David Cardozo Academy. I also got a bachelor's and master's, I got a B.Ed, Bachelor's of Education, in English literature, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and a teacher's certificate, and I also got a master's in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And I wrote my master's on the Yiddish writer Chaim Grade. It's very interesting.
So when you say in Yiddish Grade,
the writer.
But if you say, when you say in Yiddish Grade.
Oh, there's a song by A.V. Rottenberg called Yeshiva Shareid.
Yeah.
Yeshiva Shareid, Yeshiva Shashrach.
Take Epis Grade, Agavade. Yeah.
You're right. So grad is a word in Yiddish, which is difficult to translate.
Yeah.
Indeed, actually, whatever. Taka epis grade, gewaltige Sach. Grade, geheert, von jenem, was a good. Anyway, So a very strong interest in both classic Judaic studies, Torah, Tanakh, Gemara. I used to be a big Bal Halacha from a very, very young age. 12 years old.
What's pshat? In other words, Bal Halacha, you knew Halacha very well?
I knew Halacha very well. My father was a Bal Halacha. The Zirkinds, in other words, my family are known as Balei Halacha, Shulchan Aruch Yidden.
Right.
They study Halacha in great detail, and Halacha is very important to them. Knowing Halacha, being careful about Halacha, mastering Halacha. So at a very young age, when I was about 12 years old, I was learning what arguably is a koilo level halacha. I mean, I was learning Oire Chaim, not Yehuda, but I was learning Oire Chaim with the Tur, the Beis Yosef, the Bach.
At 12 years old?
At 12 years old. The Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avraham, the Taz, the Machzos HaShekel, the Levushei Sirot. All these arcane works that the Mishnah Brura quotes, and like Arzus Achayim, Shulchan Atzei Shittim, Magen Giboidim, like words that most yeshiva bachrim have never heard of, but because I was doing, and a lot of it was self-propelled, was an autodidactic study. I took the sefer. I received a good yeshiva education.
So you were an Ilui.
I don't know, whatever, but I definitely was goaded or encouraged to learn halacha. My father wanted me to know the whole Shulchan Aruch Oire Chaim by the age of Bar Mitzvah.
Now, your father was a sefer?
My father was a bookkeeper. For many years, he worked in Chinuch, in Chanoich Lanar.
Okay.
For teenagers with a different Jewish background, not the mainstream Orthodox background, children maybe from more troubled backgrounds or from not such strong Orthodox backgrounds that were coming closer to Yiddishkeit. It was an interesting yeshiva, not a standard Kiruv yeshiva either. It was one that catered for what we would call, and I hate the word mainstream, pupils, students.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was my father's work, and afterwards he worked as a bookkeeper for Beis Rivka, for the Lubavitch Girls' School. But he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. At a certain point, he was a Rav in the community. He would answer Shalos and Halacha. And really, he was a real Erlicher Yid, a real honest, upright Jew, Yirei Shemayim, a God-fearing Jew. And I received tremendous amount from him, both in learning and in terms of my values.
And where are you in your family?
I'm the oldest of my siblings.
And how many are there?
There are 9 in total. I have 8 siblings. I'm one of 9, yeah.
Okay.
5 boys and 4 girls.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm also one of 9.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I'm right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So you also taught in Toronto.
Correct.
You're a Maggid Shir there.
Correct.
You're 22.
About, yeah.
And then at some point is 2002, 2003. You were born in
all
1979.
The way at the tail end of 1979.
So you're born in 1979. I'm born in 1978, by the way.
Okay.
So you're 22 at the age of in 2001, correct? You just turned 22 in 2001. So 2001, 2002.
At the end of 2021, correct.
Yeah, so 2001, 2002, not 21. 2000.
What?
Yeah.
Go more like by 1980s. That would be like, take those 15 days at the end of December.
Okay.
And
so 2002, you're 22 years old. You're in Toronto.
I was first in Melbourne, Australia. Where I went there to learn Yehuda, to learn Smicha, and I spent an extra year. My grandfather, Rabbi Yitzchak David Groner Olav Shalom. Rabbi Yitzchak David Groner Olav
he's your grandfather?
My grandfather was the head shliach of Melbourne.
Okay.
The head Lubavitch shliach of Melbourne. So I was makabel from him also a lot. And I went there.
So your cousins, you're with the Telsness?
Correct, absolutely. I'm their first cousins.
Okay.
That mishpacha. That probably explains a lot. But
no, I'm from England, so I know the Telsness,
you know
obviously.
Okay, yeah.
Very nice people.
Yeah.
Okay, so you went to Melbourne, and then you were teaching in Toronto.
Yeah.
And what happened after Toronto? 22, 23? Because 2006, you went to Israel.
Yeah,
which is when you're 25.
I was
26.
26 at the time when I first went to Israel. I mean, I'll just say it as it is, not beat around the bush. I went through a profound religious crisis during those years, like probably starting around the age of 20, 21. It was a burgeoning religious crisis of questioning a lot of things. It is really the age of adolescence and identity formation. And while many people, not all, definitely not all, but many people may undergo that stage without a hitch, they just develop as adults within their respective communities. For me, I was having a very hard time trying to, I guess, feel that what I was being taught is both true and also talks to me, something that I can connect with on an existential level. So I've been on an intellectual, existential, religious journey ever since my early adolescence.
So what would you say precipitated these questions? Was there an event, or was it just part of your personality?
Well, that's a very, very complex question. I can spend a whole life in therapy trying to figure out these questions, like trying to figure out exactly what led to what. And ultimately, I think people's trajectories are mysteries. In other words, we might know certain things, but do we really get down to the bottom of it? I would say there was a confluence of many, many different factors together, including emotional factors, like feeling that my education and my upbringing was a right fit for my personality. Mm-hmm. There were issues there. In other words, the setting in which somebody is raised doesn't necessarily match their personality. And it can be totally a personality thing. I mean, for example, there are some people who are not interested in studying a whole day. I didn't have that problem. Being academic wasn't my problem.
You enjoyed learning.
But I enjoyed learning. But I'm just giving an example that there are people, for example, they're not cut out to sit and learn Gemara 12 hours a day. And therefore, they, for example, they need to do something else with their life.
Yeah.
And if the only religious option available to them is yeshiva and kollel, they're going to see greener pastures.
And there's some people just Bali Taiva as well.
There are people that are Bali Taiva as well.
But that wasn't you as
well. That wasn't the overt cause. You know, there's always the rationalization or the convenient canard, if you will, that all people that go on a religious journey are really Bali Taiva. But that's being reductionist.
Yeah.
There might be an element of it which is true, and we all have taivas. I don't want to eliminate this as a factor.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I wouldn't consider that to be the most important factor. I think it was a combination of emotional factors and intellectual factors. In other words, both my personality, which was unique, maybe different than a different personality than what my upbringing perhaps molded me to be. Mm-hmm. Whether it was my family or at yeshiva, I had my own interests, my own curiosity, intellectual curiosity. And I think the intellectual part also definitely played a role. From a very young age,
but Chabad is really or considers itself and puts itself up as the intellectual variation of Hasidic Judaism, and takes into consideration a lot of the intellectual, there's a lot of questions within it. None of that wasn't enough for you?
Well, to be honest, I definitely benefited from Chabad. One of our mutual teachers was Rabbi Yoel Khan, the Rebbe's Chayzer. And I must say that when I first started listening to Rabbi Yoel Shiurim on Tanya, well, I went through my nigla phase, my halacha phase, when I was about 12 or 13 years old, as I described to you. And although my father wanted me to finish all of Shulchan Aruch HaRechaim of the Alter Rebbe, Shulchan Aruch HaRav, before I was bar mitzvah, that didn't really pan out. But I did learn a large portions of Rechaim, some of which I knew Baal Peh Mila B'Mila from Shulchan Aruch HaRav. When I was a kid, I was known as the walkie-talkie Shulchan Aruch. And I'm not saying this to brag, but just to give you an idea of the intense education that I got. In other words, the value of halacha. Other people would be chazering Tanya Baal Peh. But in my house, the value of halacha was so strong.
Yeah.
And that is why my initial phase was more of a nigla phase. What nigla just means the exoteric part of Torah as opposed to the esoteric part of Torah. Gemara, Halacha, Tanakh, as opposed to Kabbalah, Hasidus, and things like that. But then when I got a little bit older, I started getting interested not only in the what, but also the why. Mm-hmm. The why and wherefore. Why are we here? Like, what is life all about? Not just, what does the Shulchan Aruch tell me I got to do? And that is an ongoing journey. So one of the first and formative teachers that I had in this field was Rabbi Yehudah. Mm-hmm. And when I started listening to his shiurim...
and you were listening to your shiurim in person or on tape?
On tape. I first started listening to shiurim and tape.
Shiurim and Tanya.
Shiurim and Tanya and Noisim V'Yadus, topics in Judaism.
Yeah.
Which is really a comprehensive overview and analysis of the principles of Judaism, or fundamental concepts within Hasidic
seen
thought,
through the prism of Hasidism.
Right. Ideas of why are we here in this world from a Hasidic point of view, the concept of belief in Hashem, the giving of the Torah, mitzvahs, the observances of Judaism.
With a big emphasis on Dira
B'Tachtainim, of course, making a dwelling place for God in this earthly realm, Dira B'Tachtainim. And I was really hooked on Rabbi Yoel.
Yeah.
It was a drug for me.
It's not hard to get hooked on him if you're like of that intellectual bent, yeah.
And I remember, not only would I listen to his tapes, not only that, I remember I paid long distance to listen to Rabbi Yoel. I was a shliach in like 2000, 2001, Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So there was no internet then. It was just beginning. They didn't have the Hasidus online that you can just watch on YouTube. I had to pay long distance to listen to Rabbi Yoel shiurim from the Hasidus auf dem telephone to pay from Minnesota, from St. Paul to New York to listen to
But did you
shiurim.
sit in his shiurim as well? You did, right? Friday night,
when I could, I did. And
right.
I wasn't a student then in the in Reinterpreting.
Okay.
In other words, in the in Yeshiva G'dayla post Zal. So therefore he wasn't my mashpia. Although 1 year in Masifta he was our mashpia, at least he came a couple of times a week, and he learned to Rebbe as my modern. But what was absolutely thrilling to me, I must say, was his late Friday shiurim going into Shabbos. Winter nights from Kabbalah Shabbos.
And then in the summer he would do it on Shabbos Nachmittag.
Right, Shabbos Nachmittag. But I remember those shiurim, and they were profound.
They were wonderful.
Very deep.
It was in Hebrew, and he would...
in my day, what I remember was still in Yiddish.
No, it was always in Hebrew.
It was always in Hebrew?
Always in Hebrew, yeah.
Sure, okay.
Absolutely. And so Friday night he would go, it was a 3-hour shiur. And it was on the Kutzichas that he wrote.
Right.
So it was Chelik, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Yeah. And those were wonderful, wonderful shiurim. And they were pretty packed, and they were the kind of shiurim you could sit there and, it started and then it was finished, and wow, where did those few hours go?
It was a real intellectual workout.
Yeah.
But it was Tam Gan Eden.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, I look forward the whole week to go to Rebbe. It was a workout. In other words, you had to strain yourself. I had to strain myself. He was going from one level to the next. He was climbing an intellectual Mount Everest.
Like you, I loved those shiurim, and the clarity in which he was able to present these ideas was just marvelous.
Yeah. So I was like a fly on the wall, and I consider him in that regard my Rav Muluk. I don't know if he wants to consider me, he will consider me today his Talmud, but I definitely learned. He was the person who I think opened my mind in a very serious way.
Do you know what's really interesting? So I loved Rabbi Yoel, and I had a number of, I don't know whether I'd say we knew each other. I didn't know him, but he knew me.
Right.
I don't know if you know what I mean by that.
Okay.
In other words, what I mean is he's not a person you get to know, but I spent time with him, both one-on-one and in his shiurim, and it's one of the things I'll share with you, which is really interesting, is that I remember specifically a farbrengen that he gave in the koilel. This was
the old koilel.
Yeah, he used to farbrengen in the koilel.
Right.
He used to come farbrengen in the koilel, and I would go there and listen to his farbrengens. It was just wonderful to listen to. And at that point, he was very against the Meshachistim. And he was explaining to us, and when Rabbi Yehudah explained something, he explained it from every angle.
Right.
You know, it wasn't just like he would go on for a few hours.
10 different Mishalim.
That's right. And
Right.
he would take it from every angle. And he was explaining why the whole, the fundamental of the Mashiachism does not make sense and is antithetical to Judaism. And what he explained to us, I don't know if you've ever heard this from him, but I remember him explaining that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, I don't know if he mentioned the name Armstrong, but he said when they went to the moon,
Right.
he said there was a group within the Orthodox world which said it's not possible, it didn't happen. Why? Because Hashemayim Shemaim LaHashem Va'aretz Nasan Livnei Adam, and therefore it's not possible. Shemaim Shemaim LaHashem Va'aretz, man doesn't go to Shemaim.
Right.
And then he said, this is a very dangerous course. Why? Because Torah never tells you something which is neged hametzius. It doesn't tell you something against the facts. It doesn't. If Torah tells you something which is against the facts, then you don't question Torah. You question your understanding of those facts. Because Torah never does that. It's very, very similar to what the Rambam does when he talks about Aristotle. If Aristotle was able to prove the eternity of the universe,
right.
he would,
reinterpret Bereshit's bodily.
Exactly.
Right.
So this was Rabbi Yehudah had the similar kind of concept. He said, his whole idea of when he said, To'isi, I made a mistake, his fundamental was that I misunderstood Torah. Not that Torah is wrong, but I misunderstood it. Why? Because Torah never talks against the Metzius. As I went through life, I realized this is such a fundamental, and if he only listened to his own argument properly and followed it through all the way, I feel he would be more like you and me than he was like himself back then.
Perhaps, but I definitely do remember that. And it should be said that just for the record, without getting into the whole Mishachist, anti-Mishachist debate, but just for the record, he was one of the architects, the ideological architects of the Mishachist movement.
Without doubt.
And later on he regretted
he recanted.
Recanted to a certain extent. Not fully, but to a certain extent. Just for the record, I just want to put it out there.
No, of course, but what I'm saying is that this was a man who, I think that he lived, he never read any other books other than the Chassidic texts.
Correct.
I think he learned Gemara as it related to his need to understand something in the Chassidic text. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I don't think he really understood, what I'm trying to say is I don't think he himself understood the extent of the argument he was making and the implications of it.
Right, and I think you're touching on something which is very, very, very important, cannot be overstated. And I, by the way, just as an apocryphal aside, I once heard or saw somebody writing on a blog that someone mentioned the name Isaac Newton to Rabbi Yehudah. That is Isaac Newton. Who's Isaac Newton? He was a genius. He was an incredible thinker. No doubt.
Isaac Newton or Yoel Khan?
I'm not talking about Isaac DovBer, but Rabbi Yehudah was, but
without a doubt.
in his very limited area. In other words, and that is part of the problem for people like us, that when you're living in what I call an intellectual ghetto, when your canon, when all the texts that are available to you are, let's say, the religious texts that we grew up with, so it doesn't. One could question, but the questioning becomes a lot more intense once you're exposed to contradictory information or information that seems to contradict. And I've been on that journey, also that intellectual journey, and it's it was a very, very intense journey for me, and I'm still on it. Yeah. And
as everyone should be. I encourage everyone to be on an intellectual journey and a spiritual journey. I mean, why? If you're not moving, if you're not mahalach,
then you're stagnant.
You're actually going backwards,
or maybe even going backwards.
Yeah. So in other words, a journey is a good thing. It's a positive thing. I just want to focus on Rabbi Yehudah a little bit because the time I spent listening to him and reminiscing on it is so wonderful because they were wonderful times. So share maybe some experiences that you've had or that you recall beyond the Friday night shiurim. Was there anything else that you...
I think what compelled me very much about Rabbi Yehudah shiurim in addition to his incredible koyach hasbara. I mean, some people might find it difficult to listen to him, just maybe because of his diction. But
he's got a bit of a lisp.
Yeah,
once you get used to it,
But Rabbi Yoel was a fantastic bal hasbara and a deep thinker. And I think what really got me hooked onto Rabbi Yoel is, again, the why. Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? My earlier phase was what? Tell me what Shulchan Aruch tells me I need to do. Wake up in the morning, wash negovasser, brachas, davening. But why am I doing this? Why am I here?
It's interesting for you because it could be, and I'm just imagining being brought up, being encouraged, probably not coerced, but encouraged, at least very strongly encouraged, should I say, to study these myriad of laws off by heart. You might, after a while, say, this is a lot. So why? I mean, it makes perfect sense to kind of get to that. Specifically, someone who feels, or who's brought up with that.
Right.
Burden is the right word?
Burden is a very, very relevant word here. I won't deny it. I won't cancel it. It is a very relevant, a very potent word, and I did feel it as a burden in a very strong way. I'm not going to deny it. Where does the burden end and the beauty begin? Where does the beauty?
No, but then you're going to. I'm doing this. I understand. It's wonderful in some ways, but why?
Yeah, and also, I would also say, and this is also another point, just to round out my personal story, that growing up as a Zirkin within Chabad, we had a slightly different focus than many other Lubavitchers who were very much about shlichus and chasidus. Not that we don't have shluchim in our family, or that we don't learn chasidus, but the focus was a little bit different. It was more on halacha, was more on Shulchan Aruch, and therefore. It took me a while till I got more involved in the mainstream Chabad. I get the word Chabad world of hiskashrus and chasidus and all of that. And I think listening to Rabbi Yoel Shiurim, also out of Mashpia Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, who got me hooked onto chasidus to begin with, was a way also was like a coming of age for me of maybe moving a little bit away from the Zirkin mentality to a more Lubavitch centric mentality. So there were multiple things going on. It wasn't just strictly intellectual. You
know what's interesting, that as I'm starting to think about Rabbi Yoel, it could be like he is really like the model Chabadnik of today. In other words, like I remember distinctly, it was one summer I decided not to go to camp, and I was going to spend it continuing to learn. And Shabbos I would come into Crown Heights. So we learned in Morristown. Morristown continued the yeshiva, and I was one of probably 7 or 8, maybe 10 of us, who we decided we were going to not go to camp. We were going to continue learning throughout the summer, and so we did. And Melech would come in. It was wonderful. On Shabbos we'd go to Crown Heights, and Friday night it was no one. It was a ghost town, as it is. No one's around. All the Bachar are in camp, and so there's very few people around. And I used to go to Rabbi Yoel's those couple of months. I went to Rabbi Yoel's house Friday night and ate by him. And Shabbos morning he would show up, and it was upstairs in 770. There was no one there. And Rabbi Yoel would also show up, and I remember timing how long it took him to daven Shachris. And I'm talking about from the beginning of Brachas all the way to Aleinu. It's like I was enamored by this fellow. I want to time him. How long is it taking him? And then he verbringt with us. So he verbringt us Friday night, and he verbringt with us Shabbos after davening. It was wonderful. It was just such wonderful days. How long do you think it took him from the beginning of brachas? And by the way, he was starting this way after Zman Tefillah. How long do you think it took him?
20 minutes.
It was under 12 minutes. It was between like 11 and a half and 12 minutes, the whole thing. He had no airs about him. This is just who he was. This is what he did. This is how he operated. He would sit Friday night, and he was a wonderful guy, by the way. But he was who he was. He wasn't trying to put on a show to us. He was very happy to talk all the Lashon Hara to us on Friday night about Rav Marlow and this and that. And we were bachrim. We were looking up to him. He was Rabbi Yoel Khan. But to him, he was just sitting there schmoozing.
It was just being Yoel.
That's right.
Well,
which when looking back at it, that's so unique and so wonderful in so many ways. Like he was a person who was he was who he was, and he wasn't trying to be anything different.
Right. No, that is definitely true and very refreshing. On the other hand, I would point out that people do point out that Rabbi Yoel was a maskil, not an oived, and Chabad Chasidus.
What I'm saying is that he didn't even.
He wasn't trying to. He was trying to bluff it.
I don't mind if you're being a maskil and oived. So
Right.
an oived would start davening early in the learn Chassidus, and then he wouldn't finish till 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? So that's a very
oived,
extensive davening. A regular person would start with the minyan, hoido, and finish. So it's only an hour and a half. So here we're talking about 11 and a half minutes, though.
No, that doesn't surprise me. I knew that about him, but whatever. He was who he was, and there was something very, very genuine about him.
Without a doubt.
Perhaps, apropos mentioning him, there may have been an element. I think not only there may have been, there definitely was an element, in my opinion, of his lack of awareness of his own authority, of Chachamim Hizaru B'Divreichem, realizing that when he speaks, he's not just speaking as Yoel Khan, but he's speaking about like Reb Yoel Khan, the preeminent Chabad theologian of his day, and the chief.
But that was the charm.
That was
what I'm saying
charm.
Is,
but
to me, there's a charm to that.
But there's
where
a trap to it. Meaning, if you don't realize, if you don't realize that you're Reb Yoel, that people are hanging on to your every word, and not only that, you represent Divrei Harav, you represent the Rebbe, and therefore every utterance that you make, whether accurately or inaccurately, is being attributed to the Rebbe, you ought to be perhaps a little bit more careful between the Rebbe's words and your own parshanut, your own interpretation of the Rebbe's words.
Yeah, but it was because he was a person with no heirs about him. In other words, he didn't. That wasn't, and that represented itself in that. I remember when he used to come to Yachikala, he would come. I was in Gan Yisrael, New York,
right?
And it was Sunday morning. He's sitting there on his own. It was after Shabbos, Sunday morning. He's smoking his cigarettes. I walked over to him, and I had a question I wanted to ask him. And he sat there for 2 hours talking to me. Just me and him. And there was no like, who are you? You come to talk to me? There was none of that.
In other crises, let's just put it that way, in other circles, that would be unheard of.
Right. This was like, this is, as you said, this is the supreme theologian of the whole movement. And me, a younger pisher, right? I was a young buck at the time. Maybe I was 17 years old, 18 at maximum. And I walked over and had asked him a question. He took his time, an hour and a half, 2 hours, literally went through the whole. Asked him a question. His answer wasn't just there. It was a classic Rabbi Yoel, going through what he thought from every single angle, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So having those experiences, looking back at them, wonderful experiences.
They're wonderful experiences. They're also indelible. In other words, they're searing experiences.
They are.
They're impressed onto your psyche in a way that you can never get rid of them, whether you want to or not. But they're just deeply embedded
for me, at least, in a very positive way. I feel like I feel grateful that I had the experiences with people like that, and that was part of my journey. I don't think it should become the sum total of who you are, but they have impact on who you become. And having experiences with people who are very unique is very wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So okay, let's go back to your story.
Yeah.
So at some point you end up in Israel.
Right. Yeah, I ended up in Israel, and it was.
So from Rabbi Yoel, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I have traveled light years away from Rabbi Yoel.
Okay.
And that's very important to point out. While I was born and raised in the intellectual ghetto, if you will, of Crown Heights, I kind of journeyed. I went into a spaceship, into a rocket that took me millions of light years away from the intellectual terrain of Chabad, if you will. Even if geographically and emotionally.
So which hamshach? Now let's see. We're going to get to that. But which hamshach were you into when you were in those years?
Well, I was more into some of the deeper sichas and the Maimorim of the Rebbe. I mean, I learned Anat, I learned a little bit of Samach Vav, but insofar as Machshava is concerned, very early on I started reading other people as well. Meaning there was a phase of, and it's a good question, there was a phase of listening to Rabbi Yoel, but there's
You didn't learn his Shiurim and Samach Vav?
I didn't go through all of his Shiurim and Samach Vav. I mainly listened to Shiurim on Tanya. Tanya did the whole thing.
Yeah.
Or almost the whole thing. The Rebbe Sichas, Maimorim. I also learned from other Mashpiyim. What we learned in Yeshiva, whether it was Ranat, Erechus Vesecha, Maimorim of Torah and Likutei Torah and stuff like that. Tanya, obviously. At a certain point, I felt like I had enough of Rabbi Yoel. And also, first of all, Rabbi Yoel, they call him Chayzer. And some people, I saw somewhere...
You were Chayzer from Rabbi Yoel.
No, he Chayzered himself.
Right.
You know, like, Rabbi Yoel,
like I've heard this before.
Is a recording.
You don't watch the same movie twice, I imagine.
Not usually.
No, I never. Some people love watching the same movie twice.
Yeah, yesh. Some of them.
I'm not the kind of person who ever watches it. If I've watched it once, I've watched it. I've been there. I don't ever feel a reason to watch it again. And so, like, if someone's repeating themselves, I always feel like.
But I think of it as a certain, in a certain way. Although I'm not saying that I got everything that Yoel knew. Of course not. There was so much more. But I feel like I thought of it as an analogy, like someone swimming in a swimming pool.
Yeah.
And after a certain amount of time that you're swimming, you basically get the layout of the pool. You know the boundaries, the perimeters. Yeah. So even if you can always check out another location, but you basically got it.
Yeah.
And Reb Yoel's thinking is very, very systematic.
Yeah.
Very, very organized, and also very multi-layered. In other words, there's a very clear taxonomy or typology, different levels and different madregas. Everything ends up becoming mamali soiviv absmos in different permutations and different forms.
Right.
So it's like once you heard him, you already got his basic model.
Yeah.
He's a model maker.
Yeah.
One would argue he may have even at times superimposed his own model on the Rebbe's more freer discourse, freer Maimorim, that did not necessarily call for that tripartite division of Mamala Soiviv and Asmos. But after a while, and I also felt...
Rav and the Talmud.
Huh?
His Rav and the Talmud was always his thing. His mashal.
Oh.
Mashal
and Rav and Talmud. Yeah, he would also use it to great effect. But also, I also felt that I was missing the personal connection.
Yeah.
Meaning... That
was hard to have with him.
Not only with him, but also with his teaching.
Yeah.
Meaning, there was a philosophy, but where does it engage the person? And this is also related to Chabad, because Chabad does place a very strong emphasis on bittul.
Yeah.
And although Tanya is a book that talks about Ava v'yira, love and fear of God, I felt on some level that maybe Chabad, the Chabad Shita, and again, I'm not speaking for everyone, I'm speaking for myself, and only for myself.
Yeah.
Especially learning with Reb Yoel, which was like a highly abstruse, arcane, sophisticated, abstract thinking. There was like, where's the personal warmth here? Like, where does it engage my Ava V'yir? It's almost there are two Rashi Tevas for Chabad in terms of Chabad Chassidus. There was one, Reb Yoel epitomized Chachma Bina Das, at least in the intellectual acumen of the intellectual exposition of Jewish ideas. There's another Rashi Tevis I heard that they say epitomized my Zayda. Not that my Zayda didn't know how to learn Chassidus, it was a big Talmud Chacham. And he had a ganz gut verstanden an Indian. He understood something very Groner. Yeah, in terms of Groner. I learned a lot from my Yehuda Zirkind as well, but I'm talking about my Yehuda Groner right now. And someone said after he passed away, or I juxtaposed it from something else I heard, Chabad is also Rashi Tevas for the Ches. Cham libi b'kirbi v'hagigi tivaresh divarti v'oshoini. That my soul is a flame. So Cham from Tillim. So I feel like I was looking, in me I also had, if you will, a certain Polish, some would argue, I had a certain Polishkeit, what we call in Chabad jargon, Polishkeit. Meaning I was looking for the experiential, I was looking for the spiritual high.
It's interesting because when I was really young, I don't know, 40, 50, tefillah was something I was always excited by, this idea, especially the idea of tefillah ba'avodah. And there is a little sefer kuntras from the Rashab called Kuntras Tefillah.
Kuntras Tefillah, Kuntras Avodah, right?
And Kuntras Avodah. So I learned these, read them cover to cover at a very young age. And I wanted to daven. I really wanted to daven. But I was always told that we could never reach Avira. And that was it was always a disappointment to me, because why not? I want to experience Avira. If that's the ultimate, then I would like to experience Avira. But everyone was like, no one can ever experience Avira. It's impossible to experience Avira. Which I think puts a certain limitation on. Did you experience that? I don't know whether that's
I would also be, if I may be very blunt, and or perhaps self-revealing, or both. I would argue that a young teenager, looking for physical, romantic, real relationships between people, meaningful relationships, and living in a highly segregated, meaning in terms of gender segregated environment, where there is no real allowance for having a girlfriend. I'm going to be very blunt about this. So you're looking somehow to displace your own yearnings for a woman, for a romantic relationship, onto God. In other words, you're trying. There's something that you feel that you want. You're not allowed to have it within the context where you grow up. So instead, you are fantasizing, like the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, that is most simple meaning, or literal meaning,
is romantic.
And so I think perhaps I was looking in the wrong place. Perhaps I was misunderstanding what I was looking for. I was really looking for, in other words, on the one hand, I was going through these psychological issues of wanting a real deeply, a very, very intense relationship with a person, but because it wasn't offered to me within the Hasidic milieu that I was raised in, so it was like, maybe I can have Avira to God. And then you're fooling yourself on a certain level. I
never understood until many years later, when I really started getting into Kabbalah Sari, the degree to which Avira, meant it was a kind of romantic love and relationship with God. I never understood that as a bacher, for sure. I never understood that. But when you learn Kabbalah Sari, that's what it really is.
And there are times that I look at Tanya, that I learn the Tanya, and he goes on with B'chasheka, B'chafetza, B'nefesh Keika, Leiv Boyer, Ke'esh, Tzomalacha Nafshi, the Alter Rebbe, who happens to be my great-great-great-grandfather going back several generations. He has these expressions where he's saying, this guy is real. I don't think he was bluffing. And there's a famous line from the Tzemach Tzedek and Derech Mitzvah where he quotes that he heard from his Zayda, Kishahaya Nishma, something, Rabbeinu Agadol, Admor, whatever the exact expression is, Ich will ze gar nicht. Ich will nicht dein Gan Eden. Ich will dich allein. I don't want anything. I don't want your Gan Eden. I only want you, and meaning God. So I do feel there were people, like on the Madrega of Alter Rebbe. I personally believe this very strongly. I mean, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, that he really loved God in that way. He really had that kind of relationship that other people would have in a more what would be carnal way, perhaps, in a much more embodied physical way. But for him, he did have that love for God. Again, one can psychoanalyze whether the eroticism of Kabbalah and what we spoke before, that in certain ways the Zohar and other Kabbalistic writings are hypersexual in many ways.
I think Chabad tones down a lot of the sexual imagery and certainly the sexual nature of the Kabbalah. I believe it does. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do agree with you, but I do feel there are places in Tanya, for example, where the veil is lifted for a moment and the intense heat becomes white hot. Maybe the imagery, when Alter Rebbe talks about Nishikin, to be v'yached rucha b'ruch, there are times,
but these are all Kabbalistic ideas.
Yes, they're taken from the Kabbalah. I'm not saying the Alter Rebbe alone as distinct from the Kabbalah, but I'm saying even within the tradition of the Chabad tradition,
it's there for sure.
It's there, and you feel that. And then when I'm reading this, I'm saying, well, am I a sinner because I want that relationship with another person? Am I, or how would I achieve that peak experience with God? Because who was it? Was it Maslow who talks about peak experiences? Like, is this romantic love, this all-consuming love? Is it for there's a religious ideal to have it for God, as I see in Jewish mysticism. But what about? But I also want it. I want to experience. I want a peak experience. And when I was frustrated, whether it was romantically, sexually, all these things, so I feel I was looking. Then, but let's be honest. Sexual frustration, repression in religion, in Orthodox Judaism, especially when you're in more Chabad or Haredi settings, it could be quite intense.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe I felt that there was something missing deep down. So I think, to be honest, it wasn't that there necessarily was a problem with the religious philosophy. That we'll get to us at a different stage, like you mentioned with Rabbi Yoel. There are intellectual questions, but I think just on an emotional level, there was something missing. I was looking for something, and I felt that my emotional needs, in a very simple but very basic way, my emotional needs were not being met, and therefore maybe I was looking for another philosophy that would help that. And that might be the occupational hazard of a yeshiva bacher that thinks that intellectual speculation, some might say intellectual masturbation, can replace other needs. So
I wonder, because we both, as teenagers, experienced what I consider to be a very traumatic event with the passing of the Rebbe.
Right.
And then the relationship, which is supposed to be between Rebbe and Chassid, which was very much focused on in our upbringing, was no longer there anymore. And I remember distinctly people telling me, like, why do you need that? You have all his books. And I, as a teenager, I remember adults telling me that, and it was such a baffling thing. Like, what do you mean? You know, there was this thing that one of the Rebbes said, you know, Ich gehe in Himmel. Yeah.
Right.
And so this idea of like, so the hostik ksavim. So if you have the ksavim, this is nafshi ksavis yehovis, and therefore you have me. And it just was a baffling argument to me. I just didn't understand it. Like, because I think we want human connection. Humans want human connection. And one of the things which so I wonder, like in your journey, I know in my journey, I think that the idea of having a connection with someone who has passed and that should continue on feels like a total anathema to me, at least the way I exist as a human, which is why Christianity, for example, is totally not attractive to me. But I'm just wondering, it's not the only reason, other reasons as well.
Right.
But I wonder whether this yearning which you had for this connection and not having a Rebbe had any impact, or what impact?
Well, I think it had a very, very strong impact on me. That cheser nafshi, that emotional privation, deprivation, that emotional lack or want, and it was in other areas as well. It was in interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, and my relationship with family members. There was a desire for a closer relationship that wasn't met, and that's the story of my life in many ways. That desire for a close relationship that hasn't come to fruition. But in terms of the Rebbe, and that's a profound reality that I live every day. And shouldn't be swept under the rug. But I do feel you're right. I do feel that there are many elements about Lubavitch and the Rebbe and the trauma that ensued as a result of Gimel Tammuz, the day of the Rebbe's passing. Gimel Tammuz was the most confusing day of my life, and I'm sure for many other people as well. Maybe we can get to it a little bit more later, depending if you want to talk about it. But to talk to your point about missing the emotional relationship with a real person, absolutely. I mean, the person who drove it home the most for me, I would say, was Rabbi J.J. Hecht Olav Hashalom. Yaakov Yehuda Olav Hashalom. Rabbi J.J. Hecht was a tremendous personality, and he would translate the Rebbe Sichas. I mean, Rabbi Hecht was a multi-talented, a person of many, many different hats. And he did many, many different things. He ran the National Committee for the Furtherance of Jewish Education. He was involved in tremendous educational activism, whether it was the Release Time program. He did many, many things. I don't want to reduce him to just.
Was your father worked for him? Your father did Release Time?
No, my father did. No, that's an uncle of mine.
Oh, your uncle did Release Time.
Uncle,
I worked very closely with your uncle once because I ran the Release Time Winter Day Camp. Very nice guy.
Yeah, Shazak. So Shazak, my uncle Shneur Zalman Kalman, he worked. He still works for Release Time, which is one of the programs.
Yeah.
There's Shalosh, Yuri Limudei Adas, or Shir Limudei Adas, religious instruction. Anyways, but one of the things that Rabbi Hecht did was he would translate the Rebbe Sichas from Yiddish to English, for the children, the children rallies.
I remember that.
And also on the radio. During the big Farbrengens, he would translate on WEVD or other
simultaneous translation
after the Sikha.
Okay.
After the Sikha, I think Rabbi Manas Friedman and others would do simultaneous. I don't think he did simultaneous. He would hear the Rebbe. I actually remember one time. This is just off the cuff. I remember one time. I think it was Sukkot Tafshim Memches, 1988. Sukkot of 1988. The Rebbe was very disappointed that the teachers or those that were charged with taking care of the younger, the students, the boys and girls, weren't doing their jobs. The kids were misbehaving, and many of them didn't understand Yiddish, or even if I did understand Yiddish, I didn't understand everything what the Rebbe said. It was above my head at that age, even if I understood individual words.
Und du hast geredet Jiddisch und
Ich habe geredet Jiddisch, ja.
Und auch viele du hast nicht verstanden.
Na viele ich habe nicht verstanden. Es ist sehr schwer zu verstehen, was der Rebbe hat gesagt. Als ein Kind von 10, 11, 12 Jahren alt.
And he wasn't talking like to children.
No. Although the interesting thing is we're going in a bit of circles, but I will mention, just as a Yiddishist, that's also one of the things that I do. I'm interested in Yiddish literature and Yiddish language. Sometimes the Rebbe's most articulate or expressive or eloquent Yiddish came out dafka when he spoke to women and children, because when he spoke to men, he would use a lot of
rabbinic language.
He would use rabbinic language, right?
Yeah.
So
he was more scholarly.
He was more scholarly. He would use more lush. We resort to a lot more Lashon Kodesh.
Yeah.
For example, in Zusammenhang instead of V'shaychas. Okay, yeah. I'm just giving one. Ungain instead of Mamshech Zayin. I'm just giving a few examples for those who know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Sometimes the Rebbe did try to, at least in the Yiddish, to express himself in a way that he thought that the women and children would understand, using more Yiddish words as opposed to the more rabbinic Lashon
But
Kodesh.
it was kind of strange, because I remember going to his memories I haven't thought of in many, many years. But I must have been 7 years old, and we went to Crown Heights. You were born there, so you were seeing it the whole time. But we would go to visit, and went to visit the Rebbe, and there was like Yechidus at that point. There was Yechidus for the small group of guests which came. So there was maybe 40, 50 people, and they would clear out the whole shul downstairs in 770, and then there was men on one side, women on the other side, and he would talk just to us. It was group Yechidus is what it was. And really, it was just another Sikha. Right? And afterwards, when he finished, we would all go into groups, and someone would tell us what he had said. Now, the vast majority of us, I'm sure, didn't speak Yiddish. But he wouldn't talk in English to the group.
Right. And Rabbi, so getting back to that Sikha,
yeah.
that's true. I just want to mention the point. Getting back to that Sikha, that was Cholamoid Sukkos, if I'm not mistaken, Tashim and Ches. The Rebbe observed that while he was talking, the kids were playing around, fidgeting, whatever, fiddling around. They didn't have their smartphones then. There were no smartphones. But they, and the Madrichim, the ones that were supposed to take care of the kids, weren't doing their job. And the Rebbe rebuked them. He rebuked them. And J.J. Hecht said afterwards, I'm not going to translate what the Rebbe said. He said, I refuse to translate. But what really drove home the point that at the end of every rally, he would give the Rebbe a bracha. And those were extremely memorable.
I remember this, yeah.
My eyes well up in tears when I remember his brachas. He made it. It was his yachas, his attitude, his way of relating to the Rebbe that drove home to us that the Rebbe is our spiritual father. That's the way I felt. I'm just saying how I felt as a kid. So, and
so when you say your eyes well up with tears, I want to kind of get a double click on that a little bit. Even today, you say that.
I'll give you an example of some of the feelings that I have. I was at the recent Lag BaOmer parade in Crown Heights. This is Lag BaOmer was Sunday almost 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Last Sunday, not this past Sunday, last Sunday. And they have when the Rebbe would come out to the Lag BaOmer parades that would come on Sunday, they would play Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin. Mm-hmm. They played that song, whatever Simcha Friedman from Israel was the guest vocalist. But when they played it, tears started welling up in my eyes, remembering the Lag BaOmer parades that I remember as a kid. So there is something very deeply emotional, even though I've traveled light years away. But there is something very, very primal about that impression of the Rebbe as a kind of spiritual father figure to us.
But we were brought up. He was larger than life to us.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. You probably experienced it much more than I did because you lived there.
Right.
But still, as part of the extended Chabad community, we lived in England, went to Chabad schools, used to wake up in the middle of the night to listen to him speak, and et cetera, et cetera. He loomed very, very large for us, obviously. And we believed that he was Mashiach. We really did. We believed that he was the greatest Jewish leader that ever lived. In other words, this was a person it was drilled home to us that this was not just a Jewish leader, not just a great Jewish leader, but the greatest Jewish leader ever to live.
Absolutely.
And we, as kids, believed that. Why wouldn't you?
Right.
If that's what you were told. And we believed that he was going to end this galus, and that's it. This was it. We believed.
Absolutely. Every fiber of our being.
Exactly.
Right.
And we also I believed at least, that he was never going to die. Because Mashiach didn't die. By the way, Mashiach Ben HaMesim was not in...
That wasn't part of the discourse till Gimel Tammuz, right.
It was clear that he was not going to die because he's the Messiah, and the Messiah doesn't die.
Absolutely.
Then he died. And there's an innocence which was taken away at that moment, which they say, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle, to use another expression.
That kind of, once the faith is broken by an event that is so clearly against everything that you were taught. And who taught us that, by the way? He did. This wasn't something which Rabbi Yehudah taught or something. It all came from his teachings. It was the most confusing
day of my life.
I would venture to say, for me at least, one of the most traumatic and transformative days of my life.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is to a large degree, I believe, and I want to issue a disclaimer before I make the next statement. I have my own personal opinions about Lubavitch. Personally, although I don't consider myself a mainstream Lubavitcher, I have still very, very warm feelings towards Lubavitch. And
as do I.
Many of my family, my whole family is Lubavitch.
Yep.
And I'm not going...
And we're sitting here in the middle of a Chabad community in New Haven, where I live. And, by the way, it's a wonderful, warm... It's an amazing community on every level. Just a wonderful community.
And therefore, what I'm trying to say is what I'm going to say is not to offend anyone or to be offensive or shouldn't be taken as an affront to Lubavitch. And I still learn the Rebbe's Torah, and I go to the Oyel, and even though I don't consider myself a card-carrying member of
why do you do that?
Why? First of all, why? Because I feel the Rebbe, for different reasons. One reason is I feel it became, first of all, my personal connection with the Rebbe, no doubt. Number two, I feel the fact that many Yidden come together, see the Rebbe as their spiritual leader, gives him a certain koyach. The fact that I'm not getting into, like Lubavitchers will say, of course you go to the Rebbe because he's the Nasi Ador and he's everything and Mashiach but even if one doesn't take that tack and say, okay, so the Rebbe was a nice Jew. I believe my relationship is that the Rebbe spent many, many hours dealing with different Yidden, trying to help them in different ways. And when I'm going to the Oyel, for some people, is having a real encounter, spiritual. I'm talking to the Rebbe, and maybe on some emotional level, the Rebbe is buried there, so I feel the same way. But I also feel that people or locations that are permeated with Jewish prayer, centered at that location, whether it be the Rashbi's caver in Meiron, or it would be Rab Nachman's caver in Uman, that has a spiritual power.
Do you go there too?
Sometimes. I'm not a caver yet. I don't believe in Kvarim Judaism. I'm not the type of Jew that goes to...
That's an interest. I guess Judaism has become very much about Kvarim Judaism today.
I'm not a caver yet. I don't believe in Kvarim Judaism. I'm not that type of Jew. Don't get me wrong. You're not going to find me hopping to Kedastir or Lijensk. I'm not that kind of Jew. But for people that have had an impact in my life, like the Rebbe, my father's also buried. My father, Olav Shalom, was also buried not far from the Oyel. So usually I go to both. And for me, it is a way of relating to people who have been very influential in my life.
So you go there like I go to visit my father's grave. When I go to England, you go...
To a certain extent. And I also feel that the Rebbe or the Rebbe's energy or the fact that Yidden daven through... Again, I don't want to get into theology, make it too complicated, too problematic. The fact that this has become a focal point for Yidden to daven, for whatever reason, I want to be part of that energy. Part of that vibe, but you can come here to daven. We're davening to Hashem. We're not davening to the Rebbe. I'm not davening to the Rebbe for any moment. But I feel that certain individuals, by virtue of their public service, have become conduits to help other people. Their energy, they have an energy which is a collective energy. I don't need to use the dogma of neshama klolis and getting into metaphysical sense.
Is there a precedent for this type of thing in early Judaism?
In early Judaism, I mean, even in Rashi al Torah, you have different places of the Kever Rachel, talking about Kever Rachel, talking about Kivrei Avos, the Kever Avos and Chevron and Masechta Yuma. There are sources for the Kever. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's precedent to what it has developed into today, what I call Kever Judaism. Yeah. But the fact that there are... The fact that one would invoke this chus avos to intercede on their behalf, anenu dayin almanas anenu misha ana laAvram Avinu misha ana anenu b'shvil Hashem answer us in the merit of this holy person, and that's essentially what you say in the Minor Lashon when you go to the Minor Lashon that we say, the prayers that you should help us, God should help us in the merit of the righteous people buried here. So I feel that and it can be the Bava Sali also. For me, I believe very strongly in the collective entity of the Jewish people.
I've been thinking recently because I'm learning, relearning Malachim, right?
Sefer Malachim,
Malach Malachim base.
Yeah.
And you've got Eliyahu, you've got Elisha, and Yehoshaphat, all of the various kings, and I sort of try to put myself into the shoes of of the ancient Israelite living in those times, and the various competing theologies that they're presented with, right? You've got the Baal, you've got the Asherah, and then you've got what Eliyahu Novi is presenting, etc.
Yud Kei Vav Kei.
Yeah.
Hashem Hu Elikim. Yud Kei Vav Kei is our God, not Baal or somebody else. That's what it really means. It doesn't mean God is our God. It means Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Jewish God, is the real God. That's what it means, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, but then I sometimes ask myself, like, today, how do we, like, in other words, you got these people who are considered by everyone as being the greatest leaders, but how do we know they're not the Baal? Do you know what I mean? I'm not talking about the Rebbe here necessarily. I'm talking about the concept, right? In other words, like, it's very difficult from when you're in it to be able to dissect and to be able to say, how do we know that we have that the theology hasn't gone massively astray? I'm not saying you can give an answer to it. It's just a thought process that we have, because if you look at this, what you call cave Judaism, in many ways it seems to be very different than the Judaism presented, for example, by others in earlier. And how do we know that this isn't, slowly just gone in the way which, the Kei Yisrael isn't really mad at?
So that is a whole topic in and of itself, and we don't have time to cover all of it. And I do have a lot to say, but I'll say a few things very briefly.
Yeah.
First of all, I think you're right. And one of the hats I wear is that of an intellectual historian. In other words, I understand that theology, religion has a history, ideas have a history.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily truths that fall down from the sky. This is the truth, the one unified truth. No, there is a plurality of ideas that develop historically, both in time and in space. And within Tanakh, you are presented with different theologies. There's one theology, in other words, for example, that talks about intergenerational punishment. God will visit the sins of the fathers onto the children. There are other places in Tanakh, Yecheskel says, we're not going to say anymore that avos achlu boiser v'shinei banim tikhena, that because the fathers ate rotten grapes, therefore the children's teeth are going to be blunted or soured, however it's translated. Within Tanakh, within Judaism, there are multiple theologies. And, for example, just recently there's a whole movement, there's another podcast called Judaism Demystified. They're trying to take out the mysticism from Judaism.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen them.
And to a large degree, I believe, I don't know them so well, but my senses, my hunches, they're a response to exactly this phenomenon that we're talking about.
Yeah.
These are people, some of them have a very strong Sephardi connection.
Yeah.
I think that are intellectually embarrassed by the mystification of Judaism and the Amcha, the populist kind of Judaism that has emerged from certain Sephardic circles.
They want to be very Maimonidean.
Right. But I think this is a pushback, a reaction against the more superstitious, if you will, Judaism that they see very, very prevalent among the Amcha, the folk religion. And they're trying to denude Judaism of Kabbalah to a large extent. You see some of their things are trying to question Kabbalah and other things. And my answer to that is I'm a skeptical person, and I also do question. Your question is a very good question, very legitimate question. What theology is acceptable and what isn't? What is on target and what is completely awry and off? But I would just mention, for me, getting back to my own sentiment, that I feel there's a power in the collective wisdom of the Jewish people.
Okay.
Even if I don't always agree with every detail of their theology.
So in other words, if the Kahal takes you on as a gadol, you're a gadol.
Yirmiyahu Hanavi, there were Nevi'im. Some people, I think it was Yirmiyahu. Some people said he was a Navi Sheker. Who makes a Navi Emes, and who makes a... There's a concern in Tanakh to differentiate who's a Navi Emes and who's a Navi. Who's speaking in the name of God and who's speaking in the name of somebody else. Yeah. So we can never know for sure.
Right.
And I do feel, it doesn't mean it absolves us from the obligation to remain true to normative Judaism. For somebody like me that questions many of the teachings I was raised with, like, how do I know any teaching that I was taught is normative? And
it's a great question.
We can go down that rabbit hole, and we've been there, and it isn't an easy place to be. Because something that at first blush within your community is considered sacrosanct, to somebody else can be the height of blasphemy.
Exactly. No, I think it's more of like a rhetorical question that I was asking. It's more like, I sometimes reflect upon, and I wonder. I wonder. Whether what is being practiced, this hypothetical, God of Israel, who we see in Tanakh, if you had to kind of get to the, as pure as possible, to the view that he would have of what the correct theology should be, because a lot of it is theology, what would his opinion be on a lot of what's going on?
Yeah, I hear you. I can relate to that
I don't know the answer, and I think the answer is probably irrelevant.
But the question has to be asked. I mean, and we do ask these questions.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers.
Sometimes I ask myself, the wisdom of Moshe Rabbeinu not having a burial place. Mm-hmm. I had a friend of mine who came from Ghana, and he said, in Ghana, once people are buried, they never go and visit their graves. Because there is something about allowing the next generation to take over.
They say another controversial figure, Reb Zalman Schechter, Shalomi. Yeah, very colorful figure. Maybe you want to...
I knew him personally, yeah.
So they say that he
don't forget, I lived in Colorado.
Oh, he once told
I spent time with him.
He told the Rebbe that, become Rebbe after the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. And the Rebbe said that you have the oil. So he quoted a Chassidus Sefer, I think, that the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu they didn't know Lo Yada Ishas Kvarasa Yada Yoimazeh. Nobody knows burial place, so they should have make the burial place into a substitute for a living Rebbe. Now, the question that you do getting back to your main point, the question of Lubavitch and Mashiach is a very, very relevant question. And one, without being offensive to Lubavitch, I feel Lubavitch many people within Lubavitch have not adequately dealt with, and maybe it cannot be adequately dealt with. In other words, it may be that to remain true to the constraints of Lubavitch theology would not allow one to really question the system. And there are certain people, and maybe people like us, who do question the theology in light of Gimel Tammuz, are forced to find themselves outside of the system because they don't find a theology that works that is also true to the system. Yeah. So it's like a catch-22.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you've actually described it very well. Because it's interesting, because you find that people who are brought up in the world of posthumous Lubavitcher Rebbe,
right, then
that is like, as I said, that's pshitus by them, right? In other words, they weren't. The idea that Mashiach min HaMesim, well, that's a possibility, is pshitus to them. That's always taught. So for them, none of this is like. You find fundamentally religion and beliefs. People believe in all kinds of very, very interesting things. Mm-hmm. I've got friends of mine who are Mormons, and they believe very, very strongly in the Mormon beliefs. If you told anyone around here who lives in this community that they ought to believe in any of the Mormon beliefs, they would say, "What, are you crazy? I'm not believing in any of those things." But then if they examine their own beliefs, well, 1 second, splitting of the seas any better? So in other words, like, beliefs are something which you're brought up with, and they become to you b'pshitus, somebody else that is chachus, right? So we were brought up with certain types of belief, which was, but for us, were pshitus, and then we were asked to then accept a new belief system, which is very hard to ask someone to do, especially when they're already 15 years old.
Yeah. And one of the interesting moments in the Gemara, if you will, that relate to this is a famous sugya about Elisha ben Abuya, where at least the Gemara, I mean, there is a whole different versions of what happened to Elisha ben Avuya, the Jewish arch heretic.
Yeah.
But one of the things, one of the ultimate other, the outcast.
Yeah.
One of the things is that he was told, he once saw a parent telling his child to shoo away the mother bird. Yeah. So there's a double whammy. There are two mitzvahs which say Leman yitav loch varachta yom shiluach haken and kibbud avein, and the child died. So he said les din v'les dayin. There's no judge of the world, and therefore he goes to l'tar v'sra. He left the fold. And the Gemara says that he didn't know, or the Gemara comments, Rabbi Yaakov says when it says Leman yitav loch varachta yomim, it is referring to the yom shekulei toiv, the yom shekulei arach, is referring to the hereafter.
Yeah.
So critical scholars, again, this is a critical scholarly point of view, they argue whether or not one agrees with them or one can substantiate their claim or not, that there has been a paradigm shift. In other words, if you look at Tanakh, reward and punishment is in the here and now.
Yeah.
Whatever. But at a certain point, life in Israel, in the Holy Land, was just not adding up to that scheme of reward and punishment.
Yep.
So there was too much of a catastrophe in the times, let's say, the Hasmonean time, whatever it was. Therefore, they said, if the only reward and punishment is in the here and now, it doesn't make sense. So therefore, we have to reinterpret the promise of long life, not referring to the here and now, but referring to the So that's a theological, evolutionary compensation mechanism. In other words, theology evolves to take in order to adapt to new circumstances. Yeah. And that is true about religion, as it's about true. Yeah. Now, this is rank heresy for a fundamentalist to believe, what do you mean? This must have been, if the Rambam says in the Yud Gimel Ikrei Amunah, it must have been in Tanakh, it must have been from the beginning of creation. But as an intellectual historian, as a critical thinker, somebody who's out of the box, I realize that there may be truth to this understanding that religion evolves.
That seems to make sense a lot, by the way, and plug to my podcast, see the episode on B'chakoisai, where I talk about that. For sure, it evolves. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just need to be a student of Judaism to see the evolution of Judaism. It's wonderful to see. And as the layers get added on, it becomes more and more confusing about what does the God of Israel want, right? Because it evolves, and as it evolves, it then also changes. And what I'm saying is that that's fine, but if you are a participant of the change, especially in your formative years, that's when it becomes, especially if the change didn't happen over time, but it happened overnight, that becomes very challenging.
No, absolutely.
I'm not saying, because usually these changes evolve over time. They take a long time. When I talk to people today, I try to explain to people like the change that occurred from when I was young till now. Like I can show you the change in Judaism, which has happened just over the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. It's evolved, but it's done it very slowly.
I think, yeah. I have a theory about that. If I have 3 minutes here to say la regel achas on one foot, I want to illustrate the difference between a more traditional outlook and a more critical outlook. Take the concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, the oral law, halakha, rabbinic Judaism as we know it today, as practiced today. Mm-hmm. So the traditional understanding is that the whole Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah, was at least get maybe not all the details, but the general rules of it.
Yeah. Rav Shira Gaon,
the Seder HaKabbalah, and all that. Critical scholars are always going to point out the different the revolutions and evolutions within Judaism. Tanakh is one version of Judaism, one epoch, one commonwealth. Rabbinic Judaism is a second commonwealth. Maybe today is a third commonwealth. In other words, they see it very much in evolutionary strata, different layers. And it was interesting, I pointed out, if you use an analogy of evolution, is a very, very good point. When you when you look at evolution, the theory of evolution, if you're looking at it as a natural progression, let's say from 50 to 100 years, you're not going to see so much change. Whereas if you compare from today to millions or billions of years ago, is vastly different.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is where the difference between the critical approach and the historical approach is. The critical approach, the traditional approach rather, looks at Torah, the evolution of Torah, like DNA in a very particular body. Meaning, the DNA code, if followed properly, will result in XYZ. In a very, very limited set body and set of functions. You can't really play too much with that DNA code because it's really fixed. Now, over time...
And if you do, it becomes a different animal.
Yeah. Over time...
Is that right? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, what I'm trying to say is that the embryo...
Yeah.
It cannot become a tiger. A human embryo cannot become a tiger, and it's programmed to have a certain color hair or certain very distinct features. That embryo is not going to doesn't really have that much possibility to evolve and change drastically.
Yeah.
I think the traditional model, the more traditional you are, the more you look at that as an embryo. Judaism as an embryo, and all of history is interpreted as really being an embryo. Meaning all these different changes that we might see are really just an expression that, like, take a person. It could be they'll adopt a certain survival mechanism, but it's all within that embryo.
It's somehow predetermined through...
Right, exactly. There's more of a predetermination. And Judaism, in other words, the person, if they grow in a healthy way, will turn out the way the DNA code tells them to be.
Yeah, okay.
They're not going to become, if they turn out to be something different, then it means that they're ill. That means that something went awry.
You smoke too much, you get cancer. In other words, if you do something outside, is that part of the analogy?
Yeah, part of the analogy. Whereas I think the critical view understands it as the more, the mega process, the longer process of evolution, where you see species have changed.
Yeah.
And they look at Judaism and they say also it's like a kind of massive changes, and more importantly, and this is what you've mentioned before, there's a difference between the more, the freer, the potentialities of a large scale or long-term evolution, in which things can evolve and take different forms, as opposed to embryonic conception, which there's one right form it's supposed to take. So, for example, how do you relate to other streams in Judaism? I don't know, the Sadukim or the Essenes, other versions of Judaism. If I look at it at an evolutionary point of view, one could argue that as an evolutionary process, there was an original Judaism that evolved in certain ways, and it can evolve in certain ways, and there's nothing wrong or there's nothing. It is an aberration that it evolves in a different way. So you can have different Judaism, you can have a pluralism that comes from one common ancestor. The Frum version of Judaism, no, it had to evolve in one way. The Frum rabbinic Judaism is correct. All these other branches are weeds, are mutations that went sour, are wine that turned into vinegar.
Yeah.
I think that's a very fundamental difference between the fundamentalist Frum way. Again, I'm not trying to say this disparagingly, but I'm just trying to say it as a descriptive term. In other words, understanding that this is a fundamental truth, that God intended one type of Judaism, and the Judaism that we have today is the one. It could allow for certain changes over time, but not that much. As another approach, which is the critical academic approach, which is Judaism is like a tree of life that can evolve in all kinds of different ways. And therefore, fundamentally, other movements in Judaism shouldn't necessarily be written off, or even other religions. And that's very dangerous to a more traditional mindset. And that also, I'm just finish off for 1 second.
Yeah.
That I think also ties into your question about how do I know that my theology is correct? If I look at Judaism like I do as an intellectual historian, as essentially undergoing a certain intellectual evolutionary process, but I have in mind long-term evolution, that I can say, I don't know. Do I know for sure that the common ancestor a billion years ago ought to have turned into one thing and not the one species and not the other one? And therefore, my allegiance also is not to primitive or pristine Judaism, but to the Judaism of today, because that's my roots. That's my direct ancestor.
Yeah. I was more asking the Shittasam, right?
According to their view, right?
According to them, I completely agree with what, in other words, from my perspective, right, it is impossible to pick this apart. Totally impossible to. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I don't actually see, for example, even conservative Judaism as an anathema. In other words, there are certain things which seem to me to be non-Judaic, right? There are certain things that it seems to me the Torah actually comes to say to the world, and you can't make it into whatever you want. I feel that some people do that, and to me, you got to stand up and say, "I'm sorry, this actually isn't found in these texts. Might be found somewhere else, but it's not found in these texts." But there is a large amount of latitude within the texts themselves to have lots of different streams and etc.
Yeah. No, I would just to finish with that analogy. There is in science a definition that a species is when they can interbreed. Once you can't interbreed. In other words, at a certain point, one can argue maybe the evolution can end up in a different species, but then there are different species. One can argue that rabbinic Judaism was very different than biblical Judaism, and academics do. But I will say it is true that if we do follow the rabbinic tradition, and the more layers of DNA and the more specificity there is, the harder it is for us to change it in a radical way, unless we do in genetics today. There's CRISPR. We do in genetic engineering. One may argue that other movements, non-Orthodox movements, are doing genetic engineering, whereas the Orthodox are allowing it to evolve naturally, like a biological process of mutations that take hundreds of years. And I think there is some truth to that Orthodox Judaism, more than the other movements of Judaism, stay more true to the tradition in a more naturalistic, slow evolutionary process without jumping any stages. Whereas one can argue more revolutionary movements or newer movements are trying to skip, or they went through a trauma, so evolution is resetting itself by adapting radical changes.
None of this really takes into consideration what Elokei Yisrael wants. In other words, what he had in mind. And we don't know. I understand. But what I'm trying to say is that according to the opinion of the traditionalists, which we're talking about, they should care about what Elokei Yisrael wants, because you don't know, I don't know, but they would want to focus on that, to figure that out. And therefore, when I ask that question of like, which is it the wisdom of crowds, or is there a real concern when you see something which has changed, right? Kvarim Judaism, as an example, shouldn't there be a reflection or a question of, this is just how it's evolved? Great, well, it's fine. We evolve. That's one way of looking at it.
Right.
Which wouldn't be the perspective of the traditional perspective. The traditional perspective should be a deep introspection of saying, has this evolved in a way in which the Yisrael would want it to evolve?
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. For me, with my more critical approach, and here I'm divided because I have a very strong traditional sensibility as well. In other words, I can give a share to certain Jews that I won't daven with, and I can daven with Jews that I won't speak to. Like they won't see eye to eye with me. The people that I daven with, I can't talk to. The people I talk to, I can't daven with. But I think you're absolutely right that from a traditional point of view, one must think about it.
Yeah.
Recently, I've been reading Shadal. Have you read any of Shadal? A person that you had on your podcast, J.J. Kimchi. Maybe we'll talk about him later. J.J. Kimchi is now translating his Vikuach HaChochmas HaKabbalah. He disavowed Kabbalah. He didn't believe in Kabbalah. So one, for example, Kabbalah is a good example of where certain people, it took the Jewish world by storm.
Yeah.
Hasidism took the Jewish world by storm.
Yeah.
There were those that had very, very deep
Yeah.
issues with it.
Yeah.
Now,
Even from within Hasidism.
right? But there were critics, and Lahavdil,
Avram Kalis, for example.
right? There was internal debate.
Yeah.
And I am not saying, therefore, that everything that Jews do are kaddish v'tahar, and I need to buy everyone's lakshan, even if it became the standard brand. I do believe that one has to be discerning, and and there are questions like these questions about going to kvarim. And also certain prayers, like Midas Harachamim Aleinu is Galgali. We say that on Yom Kippur, and there are chuvas there. What do you mean Midas Harachamim? We're asking the attribute of mercy to intercede on our behalf. Could there be an intermediary? It goes against the Rambam.
Yeah.
And I guess there is always a tension, if we want to use a model of language, between the prescriptive approach and the descriptive approach. The prescriptive approach says, however language evolves, as long as it evolves within native speakers, but even if they're foreign influences, if people speak English a certain way, then it's English. The people that are into the prescription will say, no, you're deviating from the laws of grammar. So I think there has to be a balance. If somebody, for example, will come home from school and start speaking French instead of English, or English is not English. A mixture of Yiddish, it's not English. There's too much of a foreign element. But one can argue, look at Chaim Potak's book, Chaim Potak, Wanderings, A History of the Jewish People. He claims that the whole history of the Jewish people is a culture fusion. He says the Rambam, for example, took Aristotelian ideas and he grafted onto Judaism. So he created a new shatnez in his, to certain people's minds. So this is a long-standing question, both in terms of Jewish theology and in terms of Jewish history, that I don't think we'll be able to resolve. But I do feel you're right, that we can't just let everything go, so there are 10,000 Jews that go to Beiron, therefore we cannot question their practice. No, we can. We could challenge it. On the other hand, I think I'm talking about more Hanach Lehem Yisrael. Like, let Jews live. Even if you're not going to go into the continuation of Einam Nevi'im.
No, and I feel the exact same way. By the way, I'm not saying I go to Kvarim myself, but I do think, from my perspective, that if this is what makes you happy, and this is what you feel Judaism is, then good for you. Go for it. But I feel the same way about conservative Judaism as I feel about that. In other words, like I don't discriminate. If someone wants to allow women to lane, for example, I'm like, good for you. This is how you feel closer to God, and this is how Judaism works too. That's fantastic. And the same way, if you would like to go to someone's grave and spend the whole weekend there and etc., and that works for you, great. That brings you closer to God. It brings you closer to Judaism. Your kids are going to be more Jewish. Whatever it does for you, fantastic. In other words, I don't discriminate. I'm not going to get into your tzitzis. Right. I'm not going to be your tzitzis to figure out whether your theology, although it seems to me that when I learn Kabbalah, and I learn the Zohar quite a bit, you read Chaim Potak, I read the Zohar very regularly. I know, I'm sure you read the Zohar too.
As well.
I'm joking, yeah. I'm sure you read the Zohar too, but there are passages in the Zohar which make me sit up.
And that's why Shadal was against it.
And I'm like, wow, we should really be examining this, and so we should be thinking about it, right? In other words, and so what I'm saying is that just because it's yours, I remember Melech, we talk about Melech Tzvivel.
Yeah.
So I remember when going to Melech and complaining about something. Well, it doesn't matter what it was, and he looks at me and goes, "Ich hab Teines auf dir." He goes, "Was auf den eigenen Pse, das kennst du sitzen?"
You want to translate it?
So he says, look, I have tinus. I have complaints to you. He's like, it's pastinish. It's not fitting for you.
Yeah.
He's like, you can sit on your own shit. In other words, like, people, they in English, it's like your own shit don't stink, right?
Right.
It's basically what he was saying, right? In other words, when your own psinus, when your own excrement, right? bothers you a lot, then you can start being bothered by someone else's excrement. But as long as you're sitting on the pot and you're able to read your book while your own excrement is sitting in there, don't complain about someone else's excrement. So the point is, like to me, right, it's a similar kind of concept, right? It doesn't bother me that you do your thing, but it shouldn't bother you that I do my thing. In other words, like we don't know. In other words, ultimately, right, there are really good questions to be had about all of these streams in Judaism today as we are, right? There's really good questions about every single one of them. I sometimes ask myself, the average bacher who's 292 Norton Street, who learns in the Chabad Yeshiva here, who's learning, Chassidus, and might be misunderstanding a little of the concept of Atzmus, or maybe he's understanding correctly. Is he over the Avodah Zarah? Like, is he doing idol worship? Because he's, we're talking about like very, very subtle theological concepts here, right? And so, has he been nageh b'ikri adas? You know what I mean? And so my answer is, I'm not going to be boidig your tzitzis. In other words, this is the way you do it. This is the way you do your theology. Your opinion is that you should teach these kind of theological ideas to the uninitiated. That's what you do. This is your opinion. Go ahead and do it. Right? And I'm going to say that's wonderful, but you can't pick and choose. In other words,
if it works for you, you can't discriminate against somebody.
Exactly. That's how I feel about it.
I tend to agree with you.
So when I talk about the truths, right, where I've come to, there was a time in my life where these bothered me, right, and where I've come to as I've evolved or in my thinking of it, it's like none of it bothers me anymore, because I'm a little bit exactly where you are, right? You go to the oil and you're like, but this is what makes Jews excited. So I'm going to go along with that as well, because I'm excited as they're excited. I think, am I hearing?
Yes, but I'll add another. I'll add another dimension to what you're saying. Another point. I've struggled a lot with my Yiddishkeit. I've said it before, and I've come to. I've rebuilt my shattered faith or my Jewish identity.
Yeah.
In many ways. Maybe we can talk a little more about it. But I think one of the important things that I feel is that there are two different paths of dealing with one's past, two different ways. Yeah. One is what's called rejection, the other is reinterpretation.
Okay.
There are those people that are rejectors. They reject their upbringing, they reject whatever they were taught.
Yeah.
They feel it isn't true anymore, therefore they leave it. They were raised fundamentalists.
Yeah.
They now this is nonsense, call it whatever you want to call it, and they leave it.
And they feel bitter towards it. Often.
And they feel very, very bitter towards it. And they leave it, good riddance, Baruch shepatrani vayte gefahr. That is a rejector. And there are many people in the Jewish world like us who have followed that path.
Yeah.
Or what I call, they've become reverse fundamentalists.
Yes.
Reverse fundamentalists is, instead of being a Haredi believer, they become a Haredi apikoides. They become a dogmatic atheist, for example. Or dogmatic liberal.
And everyone else is wrong, and terribly wrong.
Right. They've inverted, they're flipped, they're
and I'm talking you can be that way.
and we went on a different path, which is called what I call largely reinterpretation. We take things from our past, we don't discard them wholesale.
Yeah.
We selectively choose those things that are meaningful to us.
Yeah.
Now, certain things we may pick or adopt new practices that we didn't do before. We might change certain things. And there are certain things that we do that we give new meaning to.
Yeah.
Like I told you, the meaning of what does it mean, Laman Yitavlach Varachta Yom. There are certain things that change, meanings that evolve. There's the yayin is still yashan, but the interpretation, the cask is old. I'm sorry, the wine is old, but the cask is new. We can reinterpret Judaism. And for me, my own practice, I'm talking strictly personal, for me, there are a lot of things that I do that I've chosen to keep that I reinterpret in radically different ways. I mean, I've been reading...
Give me an example of it.
I mean, my whole Judaism is an inversion of my Judaism focuses very much on the Jewish people, meaning I've been reading in the last few years Mordechai Kaplan. I've been reading many theologians from like Abraham Joshua Eshel, Louis Jacobs, Neil Gilman, Eugene Borowitz.
Alles Schwarz,
all these names. Not all of us, some are good to fight Eden, but the point is, some of them are really good Jews and great thinkers. I don't necessarily agree with everything. The point is, I think Mordechai Kaplan had an idea, and even though he was an arch-apikoidus from a traditional point of view, he didn't even believe in a personal God.
Yeah.
But he has a
Reconstructionist.
Chaim Soloveitchik has a great essay called Rupture and Reconstruction. And I want to talk about this reconstruction that I think is crucial to our joint enterprise in our own respective ways. Mm-hmm. Now, for me...
I've never thought of it as an enterprise, by the way, but anyway.
I think it is an enterprise. I think for many of us, we're in one of these modes, whether consciously or not consciously, but it is an enterprise of reconstruction or reinterpretation.
Yeah. Maybe an integration? Reintegration?
Reintegration is also applicable. But in a nutshell, I'll say what I understood about a lot of observances is based on Mordechai Kaplan's idea that it is inverting the order of causality. In other words, the usual causality, what came first is God and then the Jewish people. We are the Jewish people because God chose us and he gave us the Torah. The Achad Ha'am, who was an Epicurus and an atheist, but he came up with the reverse vort. No, we invented God and the Torah.
Yeah, this is like the civilization, Judaism as
a civilization. And that vort of Achad Ha'am is encapsulated in Achad Ha'am's medrash that I've heard even, I think, Rabbi Yankel Galinsky quote as if it's a real medrash. It became so assimilated into the tradition that Yoser Mishishamru Yisrael as Hashabbos Shamra al Yisrael. More than the Jews kept Shabbos, Shabbos has kept the Jewish people. What is he trying to say? If you think about it, what is he trying to say? That Yoser Mishishamru as Hashabbos Shamra al Yisrael. The traditional view has that God commanded the Jewish people to keep Shabbos, and therefore we have to keep Shabbos. We have to be Shomrei Shabbos. Achad Ha'am is essentially saying that Jewish people created Shabbos because Shabbos preserves, and as a result, Shabbos preserves us as a people. Shabbos preserves us as a people. In other words, when I was a kid, I was very bothered by the fact that there's so many minhagim. Where's the mucker?
Yeah.
Where's the mucker in the Torah for X, Y, Z? Could I share a very personal story? Do we have a few minutes? Very, very personal story. But I want this to be like a leitmotif in my own life. There was a time when I stopped putting on tefillin. Today I put on tefillin every day. There was a time I stopped putting on tefillin. Whatever, I had my issues with it for various reasons I don't want to get into, both personal and my faith was in a very, very fragile state. So, I kept the bigger thing, Shabbos, Kasha, to a point where I felt like I don't want to put on tefillin. The burden, I've had my traumas with it, forget it.
What, both Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam?
Both Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. You know the joke that the Lubavitcher only put on Rabbeinu Tam because Rabbeinu Tam is the Rebbe's on Indian, but Rashi is regular Judaism. Rabbeinu Tam is the Rebbe's on Indian. But there was a time where I said I wouldn't put, maybe on special occasions I would do it. But there was, in other words, that marked for me like
on Shavuos.
A break cholaboyed, to be a litvak, was to break with the tradition. And for me, for a long time, I struggled. Well, if I'm, like we had this joke that I mentioned to you before, a svek, if I was something, whether the God of the Bible exists, and even if he does exist, whether he gave the Torah as a svek, so I could be parted from Judaism because I have svek. I had this thought. So
you had like a what do you call it, in a little tiritz in your kitchen.
Yeah, I had like a lumdisha excuse not to be from. And also, once that vacuum that you can relate to so profoundly, that vacuum that once your whole world collapses, that whole ecology falls apart, that whole network of theology falls apart, and like there's a shvira saluchas, your whole tablet. So what do you do now? How do you reconstruct a second set of tablets? So for a while, I really didn't know how can I be observant if I'm not sure I believe these things. I'm not sure I don't. I'm not certain about my skepticism. I don't know, but today's generation, there's a lot of skepticism, and there are many, many Jews like me that might be even wearing a Streimel in Meir Sharim or in Williamsburg that have the same sveikas. And they deal with it or don't deal with it in their way. I had the question, how do I know? Like, why am I doing all this? And if I have a suffix, so maybe it should influence my action. Some will argue, according to the Rashbam, for example, then what says in the Torah, it doesn't even mean that you have to put it on. It's like simani kechoisam. It can mean allegorically that you should keep it in your mind. Whatever, one can come up with all kinds of bimatayras asheres b'kufnun taimim. We can try to rationalize our transgressions, if you will, from a religious point of view, in all kinds of ways. And then I decided, it was around my father's 10th yard site, to put on tefillin again on a consistent level as a way of having a daily connection with tradition. I remember, and just another aside, but it's very crucial.
But why was that important to you?
So I'll tell you a story, and then I'll tell you why. I know this is part of the story. When I was a kid, I would do mivtzoyim, put on tefillin on other people. And I remember I was once in a building in Manhattan in the Shmata, the garment district, and I met a Jew, and we put on tefillin every week, and the Jew said I'm an atheist. So I couldn't wrap my head around
like,
this
why you
fundamentalist Lubavitcher who believed that the world was only 5'7", 5'8", whatever, like a real...
Yeah. So why'd he do it?
He said tradition.
Yeah.
And it's something that stuck with me. Now, so I'm going to go further. There was a story that happened to me that had very, very profound effect and was like a kind of paradigm-shifting moment for me, where I remember I was on one of my trips to New York, where I usually would finish off by going to the oil at my father's caver, apropos talking about the oil. And I went to somebody's house, and I had I did a podcast with him. I don't think it was ever published. And it was a guy, Chaim Cohn. I did Extra Sauce. I did a podcast, Extra Sauce with Chaim Cohn. You can Google me, you'll find a podcast. So we did a follow-up podcast, and I had to give him some records, vinyl records. He collected records. I had to get rid of a bunch of records. I came to his house in 5 towns, and I gave him the records. And then we were talking about the fact that we both come from backgrounds of really Chassidish Yidden, very frum, both his Zayda, my Zayda, both his Zaydas, my Zaydas, whatever. Strong, echte Yidden, ehrliche Yidden, Yirei Shamayim. And that we've both been on our own journey. And I told him a vart, Chassidish Svarim, I think it's brought down, B'Shem Reb Simcha Punim of Pshischa, maybe the Ishbitzer, one of those from that school, where it says that one has to know the difference between, in the pasuk, Zechar Yemois Olam, remember the days of old, Binu Shnois Dor Vador, remember the days of the generations, generation after generation. So he said, Avar Tapich Sida Zechar Yemois Olam, remember the values of eternity, the eternal values that don't change. Binu, understand Shenois Miloshin Shinoi. Understand the fluctuations, the vacillations, the oscillations of every generation. Meaning that there's a polarity between eternal values that don't change, having something fixed, the immutable pole of Judaism, and the evolving pole of Judaism, if you will. Yeah. Understanding the needs of every generation. Fine, that was a nice drasha. I finished the podcast and the shmooze with him, let's say about 3 or 2 a.m. I make it back to Crown Heights about 3 a.m. The next morning, I go to the oil. When I go to the oil, and afterwards I go to my father's caver, I see that this guy, Zayder, Mordechai Brisky, is buried next to my father. Now, I've seen that plenty of times before, but I had never really, I knew it, it registered intellectually, but all of a sudden, when I saw my father buried next to the Mordechai Brisky, who's that guy Zayder, and if you look at it, he's buried to the right and one level behind. So all of a sudden, the continuation of the pasuk of Zechar Yemois Olam, Binu Shneis Dor Vador, what's the hemshech? You know, Sha'al Avicha v'yageitcha zekeinecha v'yoimru lach. Sha'al Avicha v'yageitcha, ask your father and he'll tell you, zekeinecha, your elders or your grandfather, they both meanings are applicable. and they will tell you. To me, that was a baskoil, not a voice, a lightning that came from the heavens, but an eternal, perhaps, moment of clarity. For me, it was, I can darshan ahin, I can darshan aher, I can be an apikoides ahin, I can be an apikoides aher. But, know who you are.
Yeah.
You're still a link in the chain. And there's a Gemara in Shabbos, Chav Gimel, the Gemara says, what bracha do you make on Eidos Chanukah? So what it says, Sheikh Dushanim says, Sivanu lahalik ner shel Chanukah. What it says, Heichen Sivanu. So he says, Omer Rav Avi. Rav Avi says it comes from Leisasur, the famous Leisasur. You shouldn't deviate from what the what. And Rav Nechemya Omar Sha'al Avicha v'yageitcha. Where are you commanded? Sha'al Avicha v'yageitcha. Ask your parents and your elders.
Yeah.
Now I am somebody who's a descendant of Jews who have been observant for many, many generations.
Yeah.
Maybe there have been some people in my tree who haven't been, but I think at every generation, as far as we can tell, going back, definitely to the Alter Rebbe or others, there has been someone who has been observant. I'm not a child of Bali Tshuva. So for me, I feel very strongly, I'm still a link in the chain. Talking about evolution, talking about, as much as I might think in my mind about all kinds of ideas like evolution and CRISPR and creating new species and founding Reconstructionist Judaism, there is an elemental truth in the fact I was born to a certain tradition, and I'm following that tradition. Now, it doesn't mean I follow everything blindly. It doesn't mean there's no element of picking and choosing. There is. But what I'm trying to say is that is my fundamental act of reinterpretation. The act of reinterpretation is my fundamental is not based on a metaphysical belief that I'm convinced that the Rambam Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah is true, therefore I observe. No, I am starting from the fact is I observe because I'm part of a tradition. You want to say that Jews invented it or part of it? Fine. And that gave me a much deeper appreciation for invented aspects of Judaism that the folk invented. L'chadaidi. Where does l'chadaidi come from? It doesn't come from Anshe Knesset Agdoila.
Right.
It comes from Shlomo Alkabetz and Svas. Meaning, once you understand, and this is why I'm much more open to the descriptive element. In other words, the things that evolved or were created by the people. Because one can argue that even Tanakh, definitely edited by humans, written, I believe in a lot more human input.
Yeah.
So that is my reinterpretation.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's been such a long drasha.
No, I love it. No, I love it. And I relate a lot. One of the things, I talk about, and when I think about this, I learn a lot of Torah. I spend a number of hours a day in this pursuit. I read other things as well, but I sometimes ask myself, why am I doing this? Well, first of all, I love it, but why am I doing this? And the answer is, it's ours. We are a people who've been.
You don't know if Tayyid Tzivalanu Moshe, but you know that it's Merash Gilas Yaakov.
But I'm going to quote someone who was on the podcast, Mark Oppenheimer. He lives here in New Haven, and he's a conservative Jew. And he said, we are a people who've been obsessed with this book called the Torah for forever. And we sit down at a table and we speak a word of Torah. We do it about Torah. Everyone does it about Torah. You can be conservative.
Reconstructionist,
People say Divrei Torah. This is who we are as a people.
I hate to say it.
Yeah.
But I realize that's the truth.
Yeah. And we've struggled. We're in very, very, very good company of people who've struggled with the book. Right? Yisrael.
Right.
With Bnei Yisrael. Right? We're people, and a lot of people you look around, they don't struggle with this. They don't think about these ideas, and they haven't worried about it, and they're just on autopilot the whole time. Which is fine. That's a way. But what I'm saying is that this is a book that we read, and we struggle with this book. Why do we have so many mefarshim on it? Everyone struggled with this book. And so this is what we do. And this is how we do it. Whether you observe more, you observe less. I'm not going to be get tzitzis. I don't think anyone should, right? But the general thrust of what you're saying resonates very strongly with me. That this is ours, and also Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. What do we? Friends of mine who are totally secular, but Israel bothers them, you know, in the depth of their soul. Why? This is ours. This is who. This is our land. This is our book. These are our traditions, and we've been doing it for thousands of years, and ain't no one going to take it away from us, and no suffix or svek should be able to take it away from us, because ultimately they're beautiful ideas and traditions. But find the other thing which is really interesting is what's his name talks about it in the podcast. I don't know if you saw Daniel Reinhardt. Did you see?
I think I did.
So he talks about this idea of you can only really understand it when you experience it. And that's another concept, right? Where once you experience Shabbos, I get Shabbos, right? So in other words, a lot of it isn't intellectual.
In order to know it, you've got to be it. Like, you got to experience
There's a Gemara which I quoted for him, which I brought as a I can't remember what it was, like to his point of view, that actually it's actually found in our tradition that there's a certain Havana of things which you can only get after you've experienced it, right? Especially of practice.
I definitely resonate a lot with what you're saying, and I think one of the things that bother me deeply about other fellow travelers who have also grown up in very, very rigid communities, very observant communities, and later on question it and don't believe it anymore, and they leave it. And I feel, listen, this is ours. We grapple with the text. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I think Moment magazine did an issue a number of years ago where they asked different Jews, tell me the 5 books that are most influential for you with Judaism. It ranged from, like from the Bible to Lahavdil. I'll say Lahavdil in this context. I don't know, Mel Brooks, Woody Allen. It could be Chaim Potok or Heschel along the line. But, ranging from the most sacred texts and to people that are peripherally Jewish, culturally Jewish. And Dara Horn, the novelist, she wrote a great answer. She had a picture of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Those are the 5 books. She says, I don't care what your beliefs are.
Yeah.
The 5 most important books for Jews are Bereshit, Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. And I feel for me, this is what I'm trying to say. I'm a reinterpreter. I study Tanakh from a critical point of view and a traditional point of view.
Yeah.
I learned a tremendous amount from both. I feel Jewish engagement. I feel that if I would denude myself, and I'm using that word advisedly now, if I would denude myself from the tradition, I wouldn't be any. Who would I be? I feel my identity is so tied up with my Jewish heritage.
But one of the things I want to reclaim, and this is why I felt so strongly about this, because the way we were brought up, there's a certain claim of exclusivity to it. Right?
Exclusivity?
Yeah. That since we are the true interpreters of the Torah, and the way we are supposed to, the way we are showing Torah mitzvahs, and our minhagim are the best minhagim, and our nusach is the best nusach, and our talis and our tefillin are the best talis and tefillin, and v'chule. And so what happens is when you go say 1 second, I'm putting all this on the table to re-examine, and then you say, well, I'm not sure that's all correct. I'm not sure I can buy into all of that. And then the question is, well, now there's this kind of distance between they've claimed exclusivity and ownership over, and me, who I've said that's not the so what can happen is that you can feel that this isn't mine anymore.
Or you have been alienated by the text, or by the people who
Yeah.
claim guardianship
Yes.
or ownership of
Yes.
the text,
Exactly.
custody of the text.
And I refuse to allow them to do that to me.
But it takes, like you've said before in our private conversation, a lot of maturity and healing to reach that point.
Yeah, exactly. But I refuse. This is not yours only. I know you've got your way of thinking about it. And I know that you think that you have some kind of ownership or monopoly over the way it should be interpreted and the true understanding of it. I know you think that way. Fine. I'm fine with you thinking that way. I'm okay with you, just like I'm okay with, by the way, the conservatives thinking about the way they think about it. In other words, I'm okay with it. Right? But it's mine as well. right? You have no exclusive ownership over it to say that this is your tradition and your text and your way, my way or the highway. You don't have that right. In my mind, you don't have it. I understand in your mind, you might have it. In my mind, you don't have it. And therefore, I'm learning Torah because this is mine. And I'm going to do the traditions that I care about and I love because I love them. Because they're mine.
Yeah, and that ties into a projects that we've been involved with in the past. I've been involved, still involved to a certain degree in our conversation as part of it. A project called by our mutual friend, aptly titled Darkecha by Zev Slavin. The idea of Darkecha is Judaism your way, meaning I think a lot of people that grow up from Orthodox...
Separate from the organization called Judaism Your Way out of Denver, Colorado.
Yeah, okay, I'm not familiar with
Which
that
is
organization.
more of a
But what I'm arguing is a basic thing. A lot of people that grow up in, for lack of a better word, fundamentalist communities that say my way or the highway, they feel chased off the highway.
Exactly.
There's only one narrow road, so then wherever I go, I'm off the beaten track.
And now they're alienated from it.
Right. And therefore, they feel a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, a lot of bitterness. Yeah. And they say, you know what, if you don't want me, if you reject me, so then the rejection is mutual. I don't want to have anything to do with Judaism.
And people feel that way. And by the way, I relate to that feeling.
I can understand that very well. Yeah. There was a long time where I also felt that way to a certain degree. Yeah,
but you can't allow someone else to do that to you. Because it's not theirs to make you feel that way about it.
Correct.
It's not theirs. Just because they think it's theirs doesn't make it so.
No, but I do feel. I mean, I have a vision, the Darkecha vision. The name was given to me by Zev Slavin. But the idea is that find positive points of engagement instead of saying it's an all or nothing proposition, and therefore I'd rather keep nothing if I cannot be a fully ultra Orthodox Jew, or I need to become a reverse fundamentalist and believe and become anti-religious and. I think there are a lot of people, if given the opportunity, they will say, okay, certain things I can keep. If it means I'll drive to shul, I'll drive to shul.
But here's the thing. This is the big myth of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Everyone picks and chooses.
Correct.
And, you're either admitting it or you're not admitting it. I don't care. We've both lived in these communities. I've lived in more than one. Everyone picks the bits they like and doesn't do the bits they don't like. And over here, the minhag is to come and drink beer between Mincha and Mariv and into Kabbalah Shabbos.
That's called the Bain.
It's the minhag.
Arguably, it's against halacha. Arguably.
I'm just saying, this is the minhag.
Shechres, davening, drinking Bein Hashmoshes.
And then there's another minhag which they start having right before Bein Hashmoshes. They start a barbecue with meat, etc., etc.
Erev Shabbos.
Erev Shabbos. Samach l'chashecha.
We're getting very Londish here.
No, what I'm trying to say is that
Erev Shabbos Pesach Shecha, Erev Pesach Samach Shecha. Okay, yeah.
What I'm trying to say is that now, who am I to? I'm not going to judge you, right? I'm not going to judge that Zman Kriya Shema isn't important to you. I'm not going to judge you that Zman Tefillah, 2:00 in the afternoon, you ask me for a minyan for Shacharis. Right, etc., and I can go on and on about other, and I'm, or cheating in business, or thinking I'm going to Magan of Potter, or going to Magoy is okay, whatever else it is, right? Or the bits you choose to pick and the bits you decide to leave off. I'm not going to judge you for it. Everyone picks and chooses. So in other words, when you're going to tell me that you have some kind of exclusivity, and you're going to tell the person, oh Nebuch, but you can pick and choose too. No, it's not Nebuch. This is. In other words, you're in very good company. If you decide that you want to pick and choose the bits which are meaningful to you, you're in good company of Klal Yisrael. Because this is what everyone does.
We all engage. We're all part of a selective Judaism. I think the only difference is that the person who's engaged, the person who comes to that shul, they're not necessarily calling the shots themselves. They're working within a certain social framework in which certain norms are accepted. They're not thinking. They're not thought leaders. They're followers. Yeah. And therefore, for them, they think it's
that's just the way it is. But right. Well, what's interesting is I'll quote Melech again. So Melech used to, Melech Tzivul, he he learned by Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman.
Right.
So he used to quote Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman. So I'm going to quote Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman through the Melech. So he said that the Ovdim, who was in Lut back then, they never davened Avodah on Friday. Every other day they davened Avodah. Friday they didn't daven Avodah. So Rav Shlomo Chaim would say, you're not Ovdim, you're from the Miflaga of Ovdim. Right? Because what is an Ovid? An Ovid, when he says Shahak al Niyah B'Dvari, he says about Avodah. Everything is about Avodah. He doesn't like all of a sudden the Ovdim don't daven Avodah on Friday. You know, you're from the Miflaga of Ovdim. And by the way, Melech Tzur was probably one of the greatest people I've known in my lifetime.
Indeed.
And
a friend of mine just told me that it was just he was a going out there. There's no doubt.
He was definitely Kolater Kula on his fingertips, but he was also he had a very, very, very deep impression on me. He made a very deep impression on me, and I'd
like to hear more on Chabad. Yeah.
But anyway, the point is, Melech is. But the point is, he was just a wonderful person from my experience with him. Just a really wonderful person.
I just wanted to say sorry because I mentioned that I was going to say a very, very short story for a minute.
But I want to finish off about the Meflaga Vivdim, right?
Yeah, Meflaga Vivdim.
So in other words, like, so the people who are intentional, right, about the things they pick and choose, right? I will choose those people over the Meflaga of people of picking and choosing.
I like that one. Yashur Koyan. My friend was telling me that he lived in Morristown for a number of years, and once the Melech was a substitute in the Cheder, and they were learning Subah. So it was a very, very Shveda Sugya in Subah, so difficult Sugya. And he said his Melamed had a hard time understanding the Sugya, but he couldn't make it one day, whatever he was sick, whatever it was. So he asked the Melech to be a substitute. So he asked the Magashir, was lernt ihr? Oh, you're learning the Sugya in Subas? He looks at it, like glances at it for 30 seconds. One of the most difficult Sugyas in Shas, arguably. Yeah. And then he starts giving a shir. Don't try this at home. You look at it for 30 seconds. It's like, I don't know, like flipping through Einstein's theory of relativity, 30 seconds. Okay, now I'm going to lecture.
Yeah, he was literally familiar with everything.
Yeah, I mean, tremendous gone. And I regret that I did not know him personally just because I never learned in Morristown. Yeah. I wanted to learn in Morristown, but it didn't work out for other reasons. But I grew from for personal reasons. I wanted to learn there, not necessarily for the Melech, but I probably would have benefited from it.
He had this ability to challenge people in a way in which he knew exactly how to do it. So when I first showed up there, it's like he would call you in, like once every 2 weeks or whatever. He would call.
He knew your number, basically. He knew what.
And so it was like the third week I was there. He calls me in and goes, Levi, ich mein, als ons aufstehen, a shor frie jede Tag lernen Chassidus.
He knew exactly where you were struggling.
I'm like, so like, I get up at 7. He get up at 6 o'clock. Okay. No,
you
I was serious about it.
Okay.
I'm like, okay, let me try this. And that year, I woke up every single morning.
Oh, wow. 6
o'clock. And I learned some Chavav. I learned multiple Momarim, if not most of it, about Peh that year.
Oh, wow.
From the hours of, Chassidus started at 7:30. So from the hours of 6:30 to 7:30, every single day. And I learned about, I would wake up at 6, go to mikveh, and instead of starting Seder at 7:30, I started at 6:30.
So he knew what people were capable of doing, where they needed improvement, what they were capable of taking on.
For me personally, he had the ability to challenge me in a way in which I was like, okay, challenge accepted, and like no one had ever said that to me before. Like, why would he say that? I don't know if he told anyone else that either that year. But maybe he tried it on. Maybe that was his modus operandi. He tried it on a few guys, see who's foolish enough to kind of take the challenge.
Yeah, I think.
But it was wonder. It was the hour every single morning was wonderful.
Yeah, I guess what it boils down to, our whole discussion, a lot of it is nostalgia. A lot of it is talking about very, very thorny issues about Lubavitch, the Rebbe, theology. How do you deal with the Talmud was about? Yeah. Well, the Sikkim, I think we're both like in the, use a fancy word, liminal space. On the one hand, coming we're coming from a certain community, a very, very specific community that we know very well. and we have very, very strong bonds to that community. On the other hand, we have traveled intellectually light years, galaxies away from that planet. And the question is, how do we meld the two together? How do we bridge the gap? On one level, it's impossible to bridge the gap. But on another level, we try by different acrobatic methods of reinterpretation. We don't want to let go.
But I think like it should be instructive to people listening to this, right? That you can have very warm feelings towards the people. Like our conversation about Rabbi Yoel, conversation about Rabbi Melech. And I could wax poetic for hours about Revolve Greenglass.
Right. You were in Montreal?
2 years in Montreal. What an incredible human being this man was. Like, incredible human being. And anyone who learned by him can tell you, Melech was a wonderful guy, but I forgot to mention Revolve. Just a wonderful, wonderful human being. Beyond everything else that he was, right? And so you can have really warm feelings about the people and about the community, etc., and recognize that it's okay to say that was something which is there, you love, you have warm feelings about, etc., but maybe it's not fully for you in every single way, and you can take it and integrate it into something else that you become in the future, and it's okay. In other words, you don't have to say it's bad. Life is about a journey, and the journey doesn't have to mean that you have to totally reject or be negative or be bitter towards something else. There's no reason for that. Life's too short for it.
But I totally agree. But I think the bottom line, what I'm trying to say, and I think you will agree, that we need to go through, for us or people like us, we need to go through that change from the truth to truth. In other words, we need to be able to reintegrate or re-uptake whatever it is that we have difficulties from a point of view that we're not coming from a fundamentalist paradigm that's either true or false. I remember as a kid, when I was beginning with my struggle, I had a Kutzker moment. And I said, if Judaism is 99% true, it's 100% false. Meaning, based on the fundamentalist paradigm, emes is 100%. 99% emes is 100% sheker.
Like Zev Faber brings up the what do you call it, the hamburger. Go and eat the hamburger.
So for me, I had a Kutzker moment, that kind of fundamental. Well, if Judaism is only 99% true, it's 100% false.
So I point out is what I just said. What I just said, though, is easier said than done. In other words, I said, it doesn't have to be this way. But then going from there to where we are today, with that healthy attitude and that,
trying to be healthy, working on it, work in progress,
and the warmth, etc., towards what is not a given, and it actually involves a tremendous amount of very intentional work, inner work.
Yigias nefesh and yigias basar in Chabad parlance.
It's an avoida. It's avoida. It's not a given, and I'm not even saying it's for everyone. What I think is that it's not for everyone, and like I mentioned previously, Abba Shnichs of the Pardes, right? It's not so pashut, and it has to be nichs b'shalom v'yatz b'shalom.
I can't say that I was nichnas b'shalom v'yatz b'shalom, but I feel that even though I went, it enriched me, and somehow it made my own relationship with Judaism more complex, but also more meaningful and a lot more rewarding in certain ways. I don't know. I don't know your journey so well. Maybe you are nichnas b'shalom v'yatz b'shalom. I think there are deep scars.
Well, it depends how to define shalom.
How you define it. But I still I'm still an observant Jew. I consider myself very loyal to Yiddishkeit, even though that ashkafically or in terms of I have other ideas that are far beyond the bubble. So
the Rambam, he talks about, and I very much related to this in a letter to his Talmud. He talks about how the Torah was like the wife of his youth, and then recently other handmaids have come in and started to take some of his time, which were other kinds of under the bichalach, right? Other books, philosophy, etc., which started taking. But I think that even the Rambam. So you look at great figures like the Rambam, right? Who went far afield in their study of other texts. I mean, this is good. This is good Jewish tradition. In other words, like the idea of having someone like Rabbi Yoel Khan who only learned Chassidus, that's not. necessarily the tradition of the great intellectuals of our tradition, of our people, struggled.
But one can argue that the insular communities that we were raised in does promote that very exclusionary vision.
Yeah,
in
which
other
is
words,
what I reject.
Fine, but if we come from there,
Yes.
it is very hard
very
to
hard.
make that shift of opening up. And I'll just say on the flip side, you mentioned the Gemara about the early, like the first wife. The Gemara says, "Lakol yesh t'mura chutz me'eshas ne'urim." You can compensate for everything. And in a certain sense, I feel my Girsa the Yanka says Torah, even though I love literature and psychology, and
I feel the same way.
But Torah's Torah, and we have to find a way of renegotiating our relationship. But we're going to go back there, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, because it's wonderful.
Again, kiheim chayenu, but take it from people like us who have struggled with all the questions and the sveikas and the bitterness, and sometimes we felt the Torah sam hamaves, not sam chayim, is a poison instead of.
But I think I'm sure I've never asked it. One of the most real experiences I've ever had with a religious leader was actually with a Catholic cardinal. I was invited by the neo-catechumenal way to an event when I was a rabbi back in they have this wonderful monastery, beautiful monastery on the Kinneret. And they had a conference with cardinals and rabbis, and they took a break for the afternoon, and I was walking around the monastery, and I bumped into this cardinal. I won't say his name because I'm about to say something about him, but he was one of the people who was voted to become Pope. He nearly became the Pope. Mm-hmm. And we had this conversation, which was probably the most real conversation I ever had with a religious leader, where he shared to me his struggles of faith, his dark night of the soul. And finding me somebody, a religious person, a spiritual person who hasn't had the dark night of the soul, and I will tell you that's not a true spiritual person. They're not necessarily the Rambam. I'm not saying that Rambam had a dark night of the soul, but I bet you he did. And he's not necessarily, advertising it. Right. But this is a struggle, which is, if people think that the only ones having it, it's not true.
Absolutely not.
The greatest of our people had it and have it.
But I think today, and I totally agree with you, and I think today perhaps the reason why it's such a problem, first of all, because there's an onslaught of different attacks on Judaism, hence the need to protect oneself. But I also feel another issue is that instead of authenticity, we have cultivated conformity.
Yeah.
Today, conformity is a much safer commodity than authenticity.
Yeah. But we also have access to so much more knowledge than we used to, and therefore people might feel alone. They might feel that the only ones having this, and anyway, so this has been a wonderful conversation.
Shkoyach. Thank you very much.
I think not fully 100% what I expected, but we've dealt with, I think, some very important issues, not those necessarily that are always uppermost in my mind, and especially in the podcast, I'm not necessarily speaking about them, but have touched upon them here and there. I think we've gone in greater depth than I had previously. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Levi. It's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, same.